All right, today we're going to be talking about navigating cyber insurance requirements. Be a little bit of a break from our norm where, we're talking about technical services and technologies and solutions. This will be non-technical, but I think just as important as any solution you might have in your environment. Everyone knows me. And then when we look at the agenda here, you'll see we're going to cover, what is it, why is it important, that kind of thing. And then we're really going to talk about how to understand what's covered, how to file claims, how to determine what your premiums and deductibles will be, and things that you can do to influence those potentially, the work that you need to do up front as far as prep goes, and then expectations for improvements, because those will be expected once you go through this process and you go to renew. And then as always, we'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. This one will probably be a couple minutes shorter than normal because there's just less content that we have to go through. Okay, so what is cyber insurance? Why is it important? I think, most folks have heard of cyber insurance. You know why you buy it. You want to go out and get some form of policy that's going to protect you in case that you're attacked. Ransomware being kind of the most prevalent one that we hear about in the media. So your organization may be saying to yourself, well, if I get attacked, I'm going to need something to help cover the costs of eradicating the threat, determining what the root cause is, and then getting my business back up and running. And that is what the insurance is designed to do. It's supposed to be reimbursing those costs associated with that attack. It should also be covering things like the root cause forensics so that you can bring in a team or an organization that's part of your insurance provider's kind of catalog of companies that they approve you to work with. Go in, figure out what happened, how do you close those holes so it doesn't happen to you again, how do you clean up your environment, get your business back up and running, and then move forward. But I think one of the misconceptions, if you have not purchased cyber insurance thus far, is that not understanding what the deductible system looks like. And we'll talk more about it, but because the deductibles are so high, this really is not meant to be invoked every time you have a problem. Email compromise is one of the most common things that we see, and there may be downtime, there may be costs associated with remediating it, but when you look at those costs versus the cost of the deductible, you'll notice that you won't be filing an insurance claim for any of those types of claims. So I like to think of it like homeowners insurance, where you wouldn't file a claim every time a storm breaks a window or mailbox gets damaged. You're really looking to file the claim when your house burns down or a tornado or a hurricane damages it to the point that it's unlivable. That's really where cyber insurance is going to come in, and you'll see why here in just a second. So first and foremost, I think understanding what is covered is probably the most important part. While a lot of the forms that you fill out and read and sign are not too terribly complicated, they do contain a lot of legal jargon. They are written from the perspective of what's best for the insurance provider. So even though you might read it and say, well, this looks like it protects me, you can almost guarantee that the insurance provider has put the right language in there to say, sure, we'll protect you, but you're going to have to jump through certain hoops before we have to pay out. And I think it's extremely critical that regardless of how well-versed you are in this, that you do speak to a qualified legal professional before you sign their contract. Honestly, just look at it from their perspective. If they're going to insure a lot of different organizations, and they don't know how well how mature you are, or how well you practice cybersecurity, and they could have claims filed, day in and day out that they're going to have to pay. They've got to come up with ways of protecting themselves, and I guarantee they've done so in their language. It's also important to look at what types of events are covered. So make sure you're reviewing all the terms and the definitions carefully. For example, you'll see a lot of cyber insurance forms that will actually go and define an event, an incident, a breach. Because even though they are common terms that we use day in and day out, it doesn't mean that there's a single industry agreed upon definition, and they may tweak that because they may see, I got 50 claims filed for a breach. How can I tweak it to where I only have to pay out 2 out of the 50? So you can't assume that the definition is going to match the way you think or the way you've defined in your incident response program. And then it's also, really important to understand what's not covered, or what's not going to meet the criteria for paying the deductible. So if you look at your environment and you say, there's 20 different ways that I feel I could be attacked, and I would consider invoking this, claims process, how many of them would I actually file a claim based on what I have to do, the hoops I have to jump through, and the deductible I have to pay. And you may find that there's only 1 or 2 out of the 20 that this would actually apply to. If that's the case, then you need to, 1, understand the process for filing the claim, which we will talk about, but then 2, how do I cover myself for the other 18 events? And by cover, I mean, what are those processes and procedures that you're going to put in place to help you deal with these events when you know in advance you won't be filing a claim with an insurance provider? And as always, learning this and understanding this and coming up with a plan, regardless of how mature or immature that plan might be, is going to be better and easier if you're doing it before the breach. While you're going through a breach is not the time to be figuring out, how do I deal with this? So let's talk about the claims filing process. I listed 5 steps here. There may be obviously more steps. You could do these in different orders. This is the order I chose, just to logically walk through what I would expect to do. So first and foremost, I would want to understand and document their process. This is no different than if you work for DoD or federal government and they have an incident response plan. They may have their own forms, their own timelines, their own reporting criteria. You're going to want to understand that for the insurance provider. Most insurance providers have some expectation that you follow some process and notify the right people in the right amount of time if you expect to be covered. You don't want to miss out on getting a claim paid simply because you bypassed a process. That's probably going to hurt more than anything else, that you actually met all of their criteria, but then didn't follow their process. Step 2, you're definitely going to want to understand timeline related activities. Some things may have timelines associated, some things may not. You're going to want to know what they are, which ones require it, and what those timelines are. One of the things that I've seen in a lot of ransomware cases is notifying whoever the appropriate person is within 1 hour of detection. I can almost guarantee that a lot of folks may not even realize that they're being attacked within an hour, especially if it's occurring off hours when you're not looking at your computer and watching your files be encrypted. But even if you are, if you're the individual that first spots it, you're normally reaching out within your organization and you're going to start communicating within the organization with your MSP, whoever is handling security for you. You could chew up that first hour and have never thought about notifying the people that the provider requires to be covered. So that's one of those examples where if you know this in advance, then in your incident response program, one of your very first steps is make sure that this information gets to whoever you designated and they're reaching out and at least checking that box so that you can't be denied later. Step 3 would be understand all the forms that must be used, who you have to contact, and in what order. This is, again, no different than when you deal with the federal government or specific contracts like in defense and healthcare. They normally have a process. There are specific forms you have to use. You can have your own forms and processes and procedures for how you're going to document things, but it's not in place of theirs. There's typically a first, second, and third type person that you have to contact. They expect you to contact them in that order. If you're not getting responses, there's timelines for when to escalate. You're going to want to understand all of that and make sure that you've got it documented somewhere. Number 4, you're also going to want to inquire potentially ahead of time, if possible, as to what companies can you use for forensic support. So let's say, for example, that your insurance provider says, we will cover these 15 companies automatically, and then if there's anybody you want to use, you have to present that to them for approval. I would want to present those for approval in advance so that if the day comes that I need to invoke this, I don't have to wait for the bureaucracy of that process. If you're going to use one of the companies that they've already authorized, then you might want to go look at the reputation of those companies, the workload, the bandwidth, how many people do they have? If you need them, are they available 24/7, and how much resources can they dedicate? There are companies that, when they get on these lists, they stand out as, say, the industry best, and everyone wants to use them. And as a result, when you go to file with them or enlist their support, they're going to tell you, sorry, we have a backlog of 2 weeks, and 2 weeks would be unacceptable. So you're likely going to want to vet them and do your research and maybe come up with a first, second, and third option. And then you're also going to want to speak to your insurance provider about how you invoke them, who's contacting them, what's paid, when is it paid, how much can they do. The last thing that you would want is the forensic team to go in there and exhaust $100,000 in resources when the insurance provider will only pay $50,000. So make sure you look into that. And then step 5, look at things like how long coverage exists in the event that let's say year 1, 2, and 3, you're with one provider, and in year 4, you switch. And then a month into that new provider, you have an attack and you realize, or you need to file a claim, and the attack started when you were with the first provider. You might want to look into it, because most companies would be required to accept that claim as long as they were covering you at the period when that claim started. But again, with timelines and everything, every provider may not work the same. They may have their own setup and their own timeline. So you're going to want to talk to them in advance. You can also ask a lot of these questions when you're going through kind of an interview process, where you're trying to make a determination which provider you want to go with. You're likely going to shop around and get at least 2 or 3 quotes. So why not have a set of these questions ready to ask these providers as they're quoting their policies to you, as well as when they're giving you the different options and levels of their policies. The way they behave may change based on what type of policy and level of policy you agree to. And then understanding premiums and deductibles. This one's pretty easy, as far as I think most folks who have ever dealt with any type of insurance understand. You're going to pay a monthly or annual premium in advance. And that's going to be based on what type of insurance you're buying, the package, the coverage level, what they cover, etc. But there's a lot of providers out there that will offer discounts if you meet specific requirements. So effectively, what you're doing is proving to them that you have a level of security in place that lowers their risk. And as a result of you lowering their risk, they turn around and compensate you with a lower premium. The opposite occurs as well, that if you are very high risk because you have an immature security program or no security program, you're likely going to pay a much higher premium right out of the gate, because you're presenting far more risk than some of their other clients. They may even consider not covering you and telling you to go find another underwriter. So that's something to think about in advance as well. Do an honest assessment of your security program and say, when I go to talk to these insurance providers, and if I have to disclose information, how is this going to make me look? What type of picture is this going to paint to them? And then look at, are there things that you could do quickly in the interim to make yourself look better, more mature, show a path that you're on, that you're trending in the right direction. This may be as simple for some providers as, let's say you're working with your MSP and you sign up for some projects and you're implementing services and you're just waiting on those services to be deployed. The fact that you've signed up for them, signed the agreements, might be enough to then lower that premium. I don't know how many providers, if any, would be willing to lower the premium throughout the year if you're making improvements, but I would think that come renewal time, that's definitely the period where you would also want to bring up, here are all the positive changes I've made in my environment. Will this help me with lowering next year's premiums? Deductibles are likely negotiable to some extent. They're typically very high, and as I said at the beginning, this is to prevent every single item from becoming a claim. So you're never going to get the deductible low, but just like most insurances, you know, there's a trade-off between the higher the premium, the lower the deductible, and vice versa. So if you find the deductible being something that's so outrageous that you'll never be able to file a claim, and therefore what's the point of carrying the insurance other than to be able to say, I checked the box and have the insurance, you may want to consider higher premiums and then get that lower deductible. And then it's also important to understand, from just a risk perspective in general, what impact the business must have before you pay a deductible. So as an example, let's say that you have a $250,000 deductible on your policy, and you go through and realize that virtually every claim you would file would never even meet the $250,000 deductible level. Or for you to meet that, you would, let's say, have to be down for a week. You couldn't work. You're losing clients. Maybe you're on the brink of bankruptcy. I would honestly then sit down and think about, what is that impact? Can you withstand it? I've not known any of the insurance providers to make immediate payments. You're normally going to go through the incident response process. You're going to have forensics teams come in. They're going to submit reports. They're going to be reviewed just like any claim, and then a decision as to what will be paid out and how much. That process could be very long. I mean, it could literally be months long. So you need to understand the impact. Could you sustain financially operating your business if all of this took place, you couldn't work, and then you couldn't be reimbursed for, let's say, 90 days? If that's the case, then beyond looking at cyber insurance, you have other things that should be, popping to the high, in your brain as like the highest risk. You might be wanting to rethink how you're doing business, how you're doing IT, how you're doing security, because even with cyber insurance at this point, you don't have a way to cover yourself. And as I said earlier, the organizations that go in with more mature security programs are likely going to be able to negotiate lower premiums and or lower deductibles, again, based off a risk profile. However, I would say that if you're going to go fill out a questionnaire and you're going to answer yes to saying, I do X, Y, and Z, please be prepared to provide at minimum your own evidence, but most likely a third-party auditor's evidence. If you're already getting a third-party audit because you're doing some form of certification for a contract or for an industry vertical that you work in, that's great. You already have the evidence and you can provide it. Being able to come up with the evidence that they want on the spot could be challenging for some folks. So it's not something I would recommend if you haven't gone through a third party. The third party is the better option. The other thing is trying to not trick them with the answers to the questions. If they're asking if you do something and you know that, well, I've done it one time, and you say yes, if anyone were to come back and say, well, how often do you do it? Show us evidence, give us a report, and you can't provide it, you're likely to open a can of worms you probably don't want to open to begin with. So again, this is where I say, before you go out and take these steps, look at yourself, evaluate yourself, and be honest about how will this look in the eyes of the provider, and then adjust. Prep work needed. So again, if you pay for a third-party audit, you're going to be in the best spot because you're just going to have to likely provide your reports from the auditor. You're going to have these already in some form of repository because most likely it was mandated by the work that you do, and all you're going to have to do is attach it to an email. That's going to be fairly simple. You're going to want to look at having IT and security personnel available for interviews. Now, this is whether you're staffing internally or you're working with an MSP or an MSSP. But most of the time, there's going to be somebody that needs to join to answer the questions if you can't. So whether you're interviewing people and then taking the answers back, or you're having them join, if you feel that's what you're more comfortable with, someone's going to have to be available for an interview. What would be helpful to expedite the process and to make things just run more smoothly is if you can ask the potential provider for the questions that they want to ask. That way you can get the right resources involved. And again, whether you collect the responses or you just get the right resources available, you can do that in advance, and it's going to make the calls go much more smoothly. One of the things that you can do if you haven't even gone out and looked at acquiring insurance yet, or you've seen maybe some internet searches of what the premiums will cost, and you kind of held back from going to a provider for a quote, is look at questionnaires that either have been sent to you by a vendor. If you're a sub, your prime contractor is sending things to you. Any questionnaires you filled out for any reason, even if it's past cyber insurance quotes, anything that you've sent to other people as part of your due diligence, and come up with some of the questions that, if you're seeing the same question come up on all of these different questionnaires, the likelihood that the provider is going to ask the same or something similar is very high. And how would you answer that question, and what would you do to provide the evidence? So you can do a lot of that work in advance. You can also expect that they're going to ask for program information, remediation timelines, and I like to use vulnerability management and pen testing as an example. Right now, it's fairly common to see questions like, do you conduct annual penetration tests? Are they conducted by an independent third party? A lot of times the third party question is not there, and it's just, do you do them? And if that's the case, as long as you're signed up for that service or conducting it yourself, you're good. Vulnerability management is almost, I would say, on every one of the questionnaires, no different than asking things like, do you have antivirus on your machines? Are you reviewing logs and things of that nature? But vulnerability management is an easy one to get into and say, sure, we have a vulnerability management program, we patch. Great, how often do you scan? How often do you patch? What do your policies say for timelines? How old is the oldest vulnerability identified in your environment? Are you saying that you patch everything within 90 days, but your report shows that you have things that are a year old? If asked for any of that evidence, even though you're doing these things, you're likely going to pay the higher premium because, again, from the provider's perspective, you're high risk because you created a company program and policy structure that no one's following. And if you're not following that, and you're answering yes to the other questions, that you have other programs and policies in place, what are the odds that you're keeping up with those, or have they fallen like the vulnerability program? Again, you don't want to introduce doubt. You don't want to set off red flags. You certainly don't want them to start pulling on threads and start questioning everything that you've responded to. And then last and not least here, but expect to cover your business continuity and disaster recovery process in depth. This could be, different processes, different policies, different procedures, different people. They can be combined. There's no right way to do that. The point is that you should have one. What is the order of things that you would bring up? When do you invoke a disaster recovery? What are the timelines? How much revenue does that equate to? Each hour or every 24 hours, whatever the case may be. When do you need things brought up? In what order? All of that should be covered, because that's going to help determine the costs that are involved and the costs that have to be absorbed. It'll also then tell you how are you, or it should cause you to ask yourself, how are you protecting those assets? If you've identified critical assets and critical data with critical timelines, those assets should be segregated and prioritized, and you should have processes in place. You also want to know what the cost of those things being down are, because those are the most important things and likely the reason why you would even file a claim to begin with. And then last but not least, even whether you're just doing a discovery call, whether you've signed up for the insurance, whether you're coming up on a renewal period, expect that your provider is going to insist upon improvements while you're with them. Again, you want to do this to try to lower premiums and or deductibles, but most providers are going to want to see improvements. They're not going to want to see a trend of things getting worse or nothing being improved, because again, you're creating risk for them. Expect to align your business with a federally mandated compliance regulation or an industry vertical. So if you're in healthcare, for example, expect to align with something like HIPAA and HITRUST. If you're doing those things already, that's only going to help you, and you'll have less that you have to improve upon. Prepare yourself for conversations at the executive level on investments that you need to make. You may need to author policies, procedures, buy tools and services, make configuration changes, all of it leading to a point of being able to provide evidence that you really are maturing. And that's going to come at a cost, even if it's just your time. And then try to establish realistic budgets and timelines for achieving these goals. You may walk out of this and say there's way too much that you can do in a year and it's going to take 3 years. Fine, create a 1, 2, and 3 year plan, prioritize the items, budget for those items, and make sure that they go into each annual budget after that, and then march towards achieving them and show that trend to maturity to your provider. Obviously, it's going to help with your cyber insurance, but it's going to help you in every other aspect of your business. And then at any point in time, this is overwhelming. You don't know how to do it. You don't want to do it yourself. You don't have the time to do it yourself. Engage third parties such as MSPs and MSSPs to support that. There's a lot of times that engaging a third party will actually drive your costs and your timelines down, because the cost of you doing it internally could be passed off, and the folks that do it day in and day out can do it more quickly and cheaper than you would have, than you can do it. The timelines are given. If you're not doing the work and someone else can be doing it while you can keep doing your day-to-day work, the timeline is going to be greatly expedited. But I would definitely say don't, between trying to achieve all this on your own, don't do it on your own if you're not comfortable. And then reiterating from the beginning, don't go into this process without getting some form of legal advisor to make sure that the things that you think you're signing, really are that way, and that the claims will be paid out. As well as, again, looking for things that might be gotchas to where you believe you're doing all the right things, you file a claim, and then it's denied. On that note, I will stick around here for a moment or two, see if there are any questions. All right, and then if there are no questions, I will say thank you again for joining today, and we will see you next month.